Good evening, all. Happy Labor Day Eve, as we say, 1st of September. It's me, Joe, responding to week 2 reading. So, a couple things. I thought I got the most out of the first articles we read. From the Harvard Educational Review and the last. And so a lot of those were just ideas and that came out of that, which I thought was really interesting. The first was, or the biggest one I thought, The Turning of the Leaves, the short reading we had that Maxine Green wrote. And I loved her phrase, expressing the impact of beauty. And I think that's what we're teaching, is how to express that and how to teach that. Through all the articles, the multiple intelligences, the story about Ronald and Raoul, the other readings, I got the most out of that I think when you boil it all down, that's what we do, is through all these different methods, really try to teach people how to express beauty and the impact of beauty, and also creating that beauty. So I found that very compelling. I also really liked what Maxine Green said about standardize. There is no way to standardize the arts, which I think is very. You can kind of tell when this was written, when the whole No Child Left Behind thing was being argued and fought on, and a lot of this is nice to go back to and go over it. I also thought the first article we read, the Harvard Educational Review by Clapp and Edwards, was really interesting, and the phrases. Do the arts really do anything? It was this great approach that I think they mentioned in a theoretical essay that Ruben Fernandez, I cannot pronounce the first part of that, makes about how arts education needs to change. And I'm fascinated by this and really like this this new approach of the rhetoric of cultural production, and that he talks about culture. Culture, to quote him, culture is not what people are, what people have, or what they value. Culture is what people do. And I'm fascinated by that. And also the ideas of that there's so much education, and arts education specifically, that's going on outside of our classrooms, and how we can tap into that, especially with the digital overload that our students are facing. I find this really fascinating, that trying to tap into that. I also found really interesting, what was on the first reading, the ideas I think presented by Steve Seide, Seide, ideas that there isn't any more the dichotomy. There's no dichotomy between being an artist and educator and a citizen engaged in communities and society, which goes back to kind of what Yo-Yo Ma was talking about last week with citizen artists. And I'm just trying to find the notes as I go through all my audition notes, about how he had this idea of citizen artists, which I think goes back to that wonderful video we saw on Yo-Yo Ma, which I can't find, but it was about that. Anyway, I thought that was really cool. They also mentioned that the 21st century in that first article, also going back to what counts as arts education, how much they're getting outside of our school and engage with. The Gardner, the Jennifer Groff article on arguing the Gardner's multiple intelligence versus the three cognitive processing systems. I thought was really interesting. But the biggest thing I got out of that, and the same thing when Gardner's thing first came out with multiple intelligence, is balance. And Groff mentions that. That means balance, even breaking it down into the three processing systems of object visual, spatial visual, and verbal, as opposed to the 10 that Gardner had, which simplifies things, but again, also goes back to balance. And I try to do that with my students of use, even if you are strong in one area, and that's how you learn best, you still aren't always going to be given the opportunity to create or have that kind of environment. So I think it's also good to focus on other areas, expanding those areas, expanding your intelligences in other areas to help you, what was the phrase Groff used, scaffolding new skills, which is kind of what good teachers do. So the other big thing I took out of that article was, and again, this goes back to Gardner, which happened back when that first thing came out in the 90s, is the labels. But the labels have been used incorrectly, and they're false labels, and people get labeled something, and it's like, oh, I'm this kinesthetic learner, and I'm not really a kinesthetic learner. Why did I get labeled as that? So that was really eye-opening in terms of article, what I got out of that. The story that Linda Nathan has also about Ronald relating to my experiences with students is I sometimes I don't know forget. I don't know. We just forget, I think, too easily the impact arts has and that we have on kids' lives. And I think that's kind of got back to why I like to do this. And so that was kind of cool. Because we've all had students like Ronald and like Raoul, whose uncle was homeless, which I thought was a great idea. Which I kind of have the same thing at Juan Diego. We have this thing called the Academy of Fine Arts, which I kind of want to go visit. The Boston Conservatory, and do the thesis project relating it to community, which I think is really cool. But his story was very touching in the sense of, everybody's got baggage, and everybody's got a story, and I think we forget that. And the arts, that's one of the things I liked about these readings, is that, especially with Linda Nathan, is about using these stories, arts advocacy, that the arts matter. And that, what are the quotes she had? Ronald began to create a different vision of himself. And I think that's just so powerful. And I really, really enjoyed that, reading that, and watching her video as well, which was cool. But, the second video, was it the first video, the Ruby Chacon piece, I thought was interesting, and it's kind of all over the place. I thought it would have been nice to have an intro, because I didn't know till the very end that she was answering questions posed from a group. And that would have been nice to have an intro on her background. The whole thing with her nephew, which is tragic, I didn't get. I didn't get how it affected her and her family, because I didn't know what happened. And so it was kind of all over the place. But one of the things I did take out of it was when she went to these students, or it was a community as opposed to, I think it was a rival, another artist who was making a bid. What does the community want? What does the community need? As opposed to artists telling the community, well, you're going to get this, you're going to get this kind of a mural, but asking them what they want, what do they want? And I think if we could do that with our students, would be much better. We'd be much better off finding out what their culture is and what they need for not only from what they need from us, because we kind of bring our own thing, but to be sensitive to that. So I think that's kind of the whole point of these readings, is just being sensitive to the culture, the community you're teaching, and how you're teaching it, and also why you're teaching it. I like that she put down they're creating spaces when they were working for the unpowered and unempowered, which I thought was really neat. And also one other thing I thought was really beautiful, that students that come into your classroom, not to focus on what skills they lack, but what skills they bring, which I thought was kind of cool. So, and I also like the term cultural bag, which I've never heard before. So I thought it was pretty cool. Anyway, that's my response to this week's reading. Have a wonderful Labor Day, and especially a great September 3rd. See ya. Bye.